Sarah's American dream was shattered when she went up against her military defense company, trying to expose their culture of supplying substandard military equipment in exchange for fraudulent mega-profit. Hi, I'm Shane, your host today, with another Whistleblower expose on the Truth Tellers channel. Please consider subscribing, liking, and hitting the bell if you enjoyed today's video. These are the Military Fraud Files. Sarah Martinez thought she was living the American dream. A quality assurance engineer at one of the nation's most trusted defense contractors, she'd worked her way up from a small town in Ohio to overseeing critical safety inspections for equipment that would protect our soldiers in combat zones. Every morning, she'd drive past the company's gleaming headquarters with genuine pride, knowing that her meticulous attention to detail was keeping our servicemen and women safe. That pride would soon turn to horror when she discovered that the very equipment she was certifying was systematically failing the most basic safety standards, and that her superiors not only knew about it, but were actively covering it up. What started as routine quality checks would evolve into a nightmare that would cost lives, destroy careers, and expose a web of corruption that reached from factory floors to the highest levels of military procurement. Sarah's story isn't just about one woman's courage to speak the truth to power. It's about a system so broken that those sworn to protect our defenders were instead profiting from their vulnerability. The body armor that was supposed to stop bullets was cracking under basic stress tests. The communication equipment designed to coordinate life or death missions was shorting out in field conditions. The vehicle components meant to withstand roadside explosions were failing catastrophically during routine inspections. Yet somehow all this equipment was being stamped with Sarah's approval and shipped directly to military bases around the world. How could this happen? Sarah thought to herself. How could a system with so many safeguards, so many layers of oversight, allow defective equipment to reach the hands of soldiers whose lives depended on its reliability? The answer lies in a culture of willful blindness, where profits mattered more than protection, and where those who tried to sound the alarm found themselves marked for destruction. Sarah Martinez would learn that being right isn't enough when you're fighting an entire industry built on lies. She would discover that the very people tasked with protecting our national security were instead exploiting it for personal gain. And she would find that the cost of speaking the truth to power isn't just professional suicide. It's a complete dismantling of everything you once believed about the institutions you trusted. This is the story of how one woman's dedication to doing her job properly uncovered a fraud so massive, so systematic, and so protected by those in power that it continues to operate today, hidden behind classification levels and corporate legal teams. It's the story of how our military procurement system has become a feeding trough for contractors who view soldiers' safety as an acceptable cost of doing business. And it's the story of why Sarah Martinez, despite losing everything, continues to fight a battle she knows she may never win, because she understands that somewhere out there, soldiers are still depending on equipment that she knows isn't designed to bring them home alive. Sarah's path to becoming a whistleblower began on an ordinary Tuesday morning in March, when she arrived at work to find her usual testing protocols had been mysteriously altered overnight. For 8 years, she had followed the same rigorous procedures for testing body armor plates, a process that involved subjecting each sample to standardized ballistic tests that simulated real combat conditions. The tests were designed to ensure that every piece of armor could withstand multiple impacts from the specific types of ammunition our soldiers might encounter in the field. These weren't arbitrary standards. They were requirements written in blood, developed after studying every instance of armor failure in combat zones, refined through the tragic experience of soldiers who had died because their protection wasn't adequate. Sarah knew this history. She understood that behind every specification, every tolerance level, every testing protocol, there were names and faces of servicemen and women whose sacrifice had helped create these standards, and it mattered to Sarah. A lot. That's what made the memo on her desk so disturbing. The new testing guidelines, issued by the Quality Assurance Director and bearing the approval of senior management, reduced the required number of ballistic impacts from 15 to 8.
The temperature range for environmental testing was narrowed significantly. Most troubling of all, the acceptable failure rate for individual armor plates was increased from less than 1% to 5%. On paper, these changes were presented as efficiency improvements, ways to streamline the testing process and reduce costs without compromising safety. The memo cited budget pressures and delivery schedules, emphasizing the need to support our troops by getting equipment to them faster. But Sarah had been doing this work long enough to understand what these changes really meant. Reducing the number of ballistic impacts meant that armor plates that might fail on the 10th or 12th shot would never be identified during testing. Narrowing the temperature range meant that equipment that would fail in the extreme heat of desert operations or the bitter cold of mountain warfare would pass quality assurance. And increasing the acceptable failure rate meant that they were now willing to knowingly ship armor that would fail for 1 in every 20 soldiers who depended on it. When Sarah brought her concerns to her immediate supervisor, a man she had respected and worked with for 3 years, his response chilled her. "Look, Sarah, I understand your concerns, but these changes come from the top. The military is asking us to deliver more equipment faster, and we need to be responsive to their needs. These new standards still provide adequate protection while allowing us to meet our contractual obligations." But Sarah had read the contracts. She knew that nowhere in the military's requirements was any request to lower safety standards. The pressure to deliver faster was real, but it was being used as a cover for something else entirely. She began to dig deeper, staying late to review testing records and manufacturing reports that she normally wouldn't have access to. What she found made her stomach turn. The company had been systematically reducing quality standards for over 2 years. Always with carefully worded justifications that made the changes seem reasonable. But taken together, these modifications represented a fundamental shift in philosophy, from ensuring absolute reliability to accepting calculated risks with other people's lives. The pattern was clear. Every change increased profit margins while transferring risk from the company to the soldiers who would depend on the equipment. But the real revelation came when Sarah accessed historical testing data that she discovered hadn't been properly archived. In the computer files, she found evidence that the company had been aware of systematic equipment failures for years. Internal testing reports showed failure rates far higher than what was being reported to military inspectors. Engineering analyses identified design flaws that were being masked rather than corrected. Most damning of all, she found email chains between senior executives discussing the cost-benefit analysis of allowing defective equipment to reach the field versus investing in proper fixes. The calculations were coldly precise. The cost of potential lawsuits and penalties, if equipment failures were discovered, was weighed against the cost of implementing proper quality controls, and management had deliberately chosen the cheaper option. One email, sent by the vice president of manufacturing to the company's legal team, laid out the thinking with brutal clarity. "Our analysis indicates that the probability of equipment failure being traced back to manufacturing defects is relatively low given the chaotic nature of combat environments. Even if such failures are identified, the legal and financial consequences are likely to be less than the costs associated with implementing the quality improvements recommended by engineering." The weight of what Sarah had discovered pressed down on her like a physical force. She spent sleepless nights staring at the ceiling, knowing that somewhere in the world, soldiers are wearing body armor that might not protect them, using communication equipment that might fail when they need it most, trusting their lives to gear that had been deliberately compromised to save money. Every news report about casualties in combat zones made her wonder if any of those deaths could have been prevented if the equipment had been manufactured to the standards that everyone believed were being maintained. The human cost of corporate greed had never been more real or more personal to her.
She tried first to work within the system, documenting her findings and requesting meetings with senior management to discuss her concerns. The responses she received were masterclasses in corporate doublespeak. Executives acknowledged her dedication to quality while explaining that business realities required strategic adjustments to operational parameters. They spoke about acceptable risk tolerances and industry best practices, as if these phrases could somehow transform deliberate negligence into sound business strategy. When Sarah pressed for specific explanations about why standards were being lowered, she was told that such information was above her clearance level and that she needed to trust the expertise of senior leadership. But Sarah had seen the expertise of senior leadership in action. She had watched as engineers who raised safety concerns were transferred to other departments or encouraged to seek opportunities elsewhere. She had observed how quality assurance reports were edited to emphasize positive findings while downplaying problems. She had witnessed the gradual transformation of a company that had once prided itself on exceeding military specifications into one that treated those specifications as inconvenient obstacles to profitability. The culture of the organization had shifted so gradually that most employees hadn't noticed the change. But Sarah's position gave her a unique perspective on how individual compromises had accumulated into systematic fraud. When internal channels proved useless, Sarah decided she would begin documenting everything she could access. She photographed testing reports that showed equipment failures being classified as acceptable variations. She copied email chains that revealed the decision-making process behind standard reductions. She gathered manufacturing records that demonstrated how cost-cutting measures had been implemented without corresponding safety analyses. Every piece of evidence she collected reinforced the same conclusion. The company was knowingly producing substandard equipment while representing it as meeting military specifications. The scope of the fraud was staggering. It wasn't limited to a single product line or manufacturing facility. The cost-cutting measures had been implemented across every major category of equipment the company produced for military contracts. Body armor, vehicle components, communication systems, protective gear, weapons accessories, all of it had been subjected to the same systematic degradation of quality standards. Sarah realized she was looking at evidence of a conspiracy that had potentially affected thousands of pieces of equipment, and, by extension, thousands of soldiers who depended on that equipment for their very survival. But perhaps most disturbing was the level of coordination required to maintain the fraud. This wasn't the result of a few rogue employees making bad decisions. The evidence showed clear communication between manufacturing, quality assurance, legal, and executive teams all working together to present a facade of compliance while systematically cutting corners. The fraud had been institutionalized, built into the company's standard operating procedures, and protected by layers of legal and administrative barriers designed to prevent exactly the kind of investigation Sarah was conducting. The company had essentially created a parallel quality assurance system, one that generated the documentation needed to satisfy military inspectors, and another that reflected the actual standards being applied during manufacturing. Sarah's first attempt to expose the fraud came through what she thought were the proper channels. She contacted the military's Inspector General office, submitting a detailed report that outlined her findings and included copies of the most damning evidence she had collected. The response was swift and devastating. Within 48 hours of submitting her report, Sarah found herself called into a meeting with the company's security director and legal counsel. They informed her that she was being investigated for violating her security clearance by accessing classified information without authorization and for potentially compromising national security by sharing sensitive manufacturing details with unauthorized personnel. The irony was staggering. Sarah was being accused of endangering national security for trying to prevent the very actions that were actually endangering national security. The legal team made it clear that they were prepared to pursue criminal charges against her if she continued to pursue her allegations. They presented her with a stack of non-disclosure agreements and confidentiality clauses from her employment contract, highlighting sections that could be interpreted to make her disclosures illegal. They questioned her motivations, suggesting that she might be working for foreign competitors or that she had fabricated evidence to damage the company's reputation. But most importantly, they reminded her that her security clearance, which was essential for her career in defense contracting, could be revoked permanently if she was found to have violated classification protocols. The message was clear: back down or lose everything. But what Sarah found most chilling about the meeting was how prepared they were. The legal team had clearly been planning for the possibility that someone like her might discover what was happening and tried to report it. They had developed detailed strategies for discrediting potential whistleblowers and had created legal frameworks that made disclosure nearly impossible without risking criminal prosecution. This wasn't a hasty response to an unexpected problem. This was the execution of a carefully planned defense against accountability. The system wasn't just tolerating fraud, it was actively protecting it. Meanwhile, Sarah's report to the Inspector General disappeared into a bureaucratic maze that seemed designed to prevent action rather than encourage it. Her calls for updates were routed through multiple offices, each claiming that the investigation was being handled by someone else. When she finally managed to speak with an investigator, she was told that her allegations were under review, but that the process could take months or even years to complete. The investigator also warned her that making false accusations against defense contractors could be considered a crime itself, and that she should be very certain of her facts before proceeding further. The implication was clear. The system was more interested in protecting contractors than in protecting the nation's soldiers. Sarah began to understand why so few people were willing to challenge the defense establishment. The barriers to reporting fraud weren't accidental. They were carefully constructed obstacles designed to discourage anyone from looking too closely at how the system actually operated. Every attempt to seek accountability was met with legal threats, bureaucratic delays, and personal consequences that could destroy a career and a life. The very people who were supposed to oversee the system had instead become its protectors, more concerned with maintaining relationships with contractors than with ensuring that equipment actually worked as specified. But Sarah had seen the evidence of what happened when equipment failed in combat. She had read the after-action reports that described soldiers dying because their armor hadn't performed as expected, or their communication equipment had failed at critical moments. Sarah understood that if she allowed herself to be intimidated and backed off, it meant accepting that more soldiers would die preventable deaths, and she couldn't reconcile that with her conscience. So she made a choice that would change her life forever. She decided to keep fighting, even knowing that the fight would likely destroy everything she had worked to build. The retaliation against Sarah began subtly, but escalated quickly once it became clear that legal threats and bureaucratic stonewalling wouldn't silence her. First came the professional isolation. Colleagues who had worked closely with her for years suddenly became distant. Meetings were scheduled without her input. Projects were reassigned to other team members without explanation. Her access to certain databases and testing facilities was quietly revoked, ostensibly for routine security reviews that somehow never seemed to conclude. Sarah realized that word had spread throughout the company that she had become persona non grata, someone whose association could damage careers and whose presence was no longer welcome in the circles where decisions were made. The isolation was carefully orchestrated to send a message: this is what happens to people who don't play by the company rules. But isolation was just the beginning.
Sarah's work began to be subjected to unprecedented levels of scrutiny. Every report she submitted was questioned and sent back for revisions. Testing procedures that she had performed hundreds of times were suddenly deemed inadequate and required additional oversight. Her timesheets were audited for irregularities. Her computer usage was monitored and questioned. Even her lunch breaks were noted and commented upon by supervisors who had never paid attention to such details before. The message was clear: They were building a case against her, documenting every possible infraction that could be used to justify disciplinary action or even her termination. Sarah understood that she was being set up, but she also knew that fighting back would only provide them with more ammunition to use against her. Meanwhile, her efforts to find support within the broader defense establishment were met with responses that ranged from indifference to hostility. Other contractors claimed to never have experienced the problems she described. Military procurement officers insisted that their oversight procedures were adequate to prevent the kind of fraud she alleged. Industry associations suggested that her concerns reflected a misunderstanding of modern manufacturing practices rather than evidence of systemic wrongdoing. Sarah began to realize that the fraud she had uncovered wasn't an aberration within the system, it was how the system actually operated. The standards that everyone claimed to uphold existed primarily on paper and in public statements, simply propaganda for the tax-paying public. The reality was a web of relationships between contractors and military personnel that prioritized smooth operations and maintained budgets over actual performance and safety. Everyone involved had incentives to keep quiet about problems, and anyone who threatened to disrupt this arrangement faced coordinated opposition designed to destroy their credibility and eliminate their ability to cause trouble. The personal cost of her decision to speak out began to mount in ways Sarah hadn't anticipated. Her husband, initially supportive of her efforts to do the right thing, grew increasingly concerned about the impact on their family's financial security and their children's futures. Friends began to avoid social gatherings where Sarah might be present, not wanting to be associated with someone who had developed a reputation as a troublemaker. Professional contacts stopped returning her calls. Industry events that had once welcomed her participation suddenly had no room for her presentations or her perspectives. Sarah discovered that being a whistleblower meant becoming a pariah, someone whose mere presence made others uncomfortable because it reminded them of their own complicity in systems they preferred not to examine too closely. But the most devastating blow came when Sarah learned that her disclosures had had no meaningful impact on the actual practices she had tried to expose. Despite her reports, despite the evidence she had provided, despite the risks she had taken, the same substandard equipment continued to be manufactured and shipped to military bases around the world. The fraud she had uncovered was so deeply embedded in the system that exposing it had changed nothing except her own circumstances. The machinery of defense contracting continued to operate exactly as it had before, protected by legal barriers, bureaucratic inertia, and the mutual self-interest of everyone involved in maintaining the status quo. Sarah realized that she had sacrificed everything to challenge a system that was fundamentally immune to challenge, at least through the channels that was supposed to provide accountability and oversight. 3 years after Sarah Martinez first discovered evidence of systematic fraud in military equipment manufacturing, she sits in a small apartment far from the defense contractor headquarters where she once worked with such pride. The legal battle to maintain her security clearance ended in defeat. The wrongful termination lawsuit she filed was dismissed on technical grounds after months of expensive litigation. The congressional testimony she provided was buried in committee reports that no one outside Washington ever read. Even the documentary filmmaker who initially showed interest in her story moved on to other projects when it became clear that her allegations couldn't be definitively proven in ways that would hold up in court. Sarah lost her career, her financial security, her professional reputation, and many of the relationships she had built over decades of work in defense contracting. Yet she maintains that speaking out was the right choice, even knowing what it would cost her. The equipment she tried to protect soldiers from is still being manufactured to the same compromised standards. The contractors she challenged have seen their profits increase year after year as military budgets expand and oversight remains minimal. The executives who made the decisions to prioritize profits over safety have received promotions and bonuses, while Sarah struggles to find work in her chosen field. The system she thought she could change by providing evidence and speaking truth to power has proven to be far more resilient than her ability to challenge it. But Sarah's story illustrates something important about how modern institutional fraud operates and why it's so difficult to combat. The contractors didn't need to silence her completely. They just needed to make the cost of challenging them higher than most people were willing to pay. They didn't need to prevent all disclosure of their practices. They just needed to ensure that such disclosures couldn't translate into meaningful consequences. They didn't need to convince everyone that they were operating ethically. They just needed to make it clear that questioning their ethics was a form of professional suicide. The system protects itself not through conspiracy, but through the rational self-interest of everyone involved in maintaining their positions within it. Sarah's experience demonstrates why so few people are willing to challenge powerful institutions even when they have clear evidence of wrongdoing. The barriers to accountability aren't just legal or bureaucratic, they're personal and financial and social. Speaking truth to power requires not just courage, but also the willingness to accept that the truth might not set you free. It might instead set you apart from everyone who has decided that some truths are too expensive to acknowledge. The fraud in military equipment manufacturing that Sarah exposed continues today, protected by the same mechanisms that destroyed her career and discredited her revelations. Soldiers continue to depend on equipment that may not perform as advertised when their lives depend on it. Contractors continue to profit from practices that transfer risk from their balance sheets to the battlefield. And the system continues to operate as designed, not to ensure accountability, but to prevent it. Not to reward those who speak out, but to make examples of them that discourage others from following their path. Sarah Martinez understood all of this when she made her choice to speak out, and she would make the same choice again today, not because it was effective in stopping the fraud she discovered, but because the alternative of remaining silent in the face of systematic deception that costs lives was something she couldn't live with. Her story isn't just about one woman's fight against corporate corruption. It's about the price our society pays when institutional self-preservation becomes more important than the purposes those institutions were created to serve.
Hi, this is Shane. I hope you enjoyed today's story, reminding you that in a world where power often tries to silence truth, those who risk everything to protect others represent the best of human courage. Until next time, keep seeking the truth.